Hey everyone, welcome back to Love Wins, where the truth matters because it's the truth that sets us free. All right, in our last video, we covered the temptations of Jesus, and you may have been wondering, why did you skip his baptism? I didn't skip it. Well, I did. It looked like I skipped it. I did it on purpose. And the reason I did it on purpose will be covered in this video, because the temptations that Satan gave to Jesus, the first two were rooted in, if you are the Son of God. And we talked about knowing who we are. Jesus knew who he was. Now we're going to backtrack to his baptism, and we're going to learn something profound today. We're going to learn that sometimes you have to live off what you know, in spite of the fact you don't feel it in any way, shape, or form. That's why it's the truth that sets us free. It's nothing else and nothing less. When Jesus was baptized, he comes up out of the water. A dove descends on him, representing the Holy Spirit. And a voice from heaven, his Father, says, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." So Jesus had just gotten baptized 40-ish days prior to those temptations. But in between his baptism and the temptations, he went without food for 40 days. So he was in an incredibly weakened state. We will never be required to go through anything that extreme. But we will have times in our lives where circumstances bring us to a very weak point. It could be illness. It could be tragedy. It could be a broken relationship. It could be a loss of a job and finances. It could be several of those things combined. There could be all kinds of things that bring us from a place where we're happy and content and confident and knowing who we are and knowing who God is to a place of extreme weakness. And the Gospel of Luke says that when Satan couldn't get Jesus that day, it says he left him for an opportune time. In other words, Satan attacks, and when he doesn't succeed, he backs off and he waits for another weak moment to attack. So it's always going to be in our weakest moments where the struggle to hold on to Jesus is the hardest. Jesus knew intellectually, factually, his Father had even spoken it from heaven in public. "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." It wasn't some theoretical thing that he hoped was true based on some rumors from his parents when he was born, or what the angels might have said or not said when he was not even born. Like none of that. It was based not entirely, but most recently it was based on the hard fact, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." Jesus heard it. Everybody else, well, not everybody else heard the words, but Jesus did. He knew it. He knew it, but he didn't feel it. When you've gone 40 days without food and you're looking at that stone that could become bread and you're hungry, that's a temptation. But to do it would have been to deny who he was. And he knew who he was, even though he didn't feel who he was. You say, well, that's Jesus. I'm not Jesus. And that is actually factually true. And you should hesitate long and hard when anyone says to you, well, Jesus did it, so you can do it. Now, that is technically true, sort of, but it's not the point of the gospel. Let me take you back to the Old Testament to a story where it wasn't Jesus, and see how that went when facts and feelings collide. Jacob was the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. So when God identified himself to the people of Israel, it was, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." I mean, Jacob was up there. But if you're honest with Jacob's life story, it was a struggle from the very beginning. And we don't have time to get into all that. But Jacob ends up trying to cheat his brother to get the birthright, which God had already promised his mother would be his anyway. Just as like Abraham took Hagar, even though God had already promised a child through him and Sarah. You see, the truth sets us free when we believe it. And when we don't believe it, we do all kinds of other nonsense that causes nothing but heartache and pain and suffering and going in circles. Nonsense. So Jacob ends up having to run from home to flee his angry brother, who promised that he would kill him. And on his way, God meets him. And God speaks to him. And in that conversation, God tells him that he will be blessed, that the blessings of Abraham and Isaac will come to him. Now that's the short version, but that's all we need to know. You can go back and read it in Genesis for yourself. And then he ends up his uncle Laban's place. He marries not one, but 2 women, and then 4, and it's a mess. And in the midst of all that, he prospers, and God blesses him, and he has flocks and herds. And then God tells him it's time to go back home. Well, home means his brother, and his brother means death. He goes. On the way, God reconfirms to him that the blessing that was Abraham's and passed on to Isaac is his. But as he gets closer and closer to Esau and closer to home, fear rises up within him. And he starts making plans to avoid the threat of his brother. And he splits his family up into 2 groups, and he has gifts, and if one company gets attacked, the other company will escape. Gifts to make his brother appeased. Maybe that will assuage his anger. But Jacob doesn't go with either group. He stays back. And he ends up alone and terrified and restless. And in the middle of the night, he's attacked by a stranger. And he fights, and he fights, and he fights. And then he comes to the realization that he's not fighting a man, that he's actually fighting against God. And that's exactly what we're doing. Every time what God says about us or our circumstances, we don't believe it. When we don't believe what God says, we're fighting against him. And in the middle of the fighting, this assailant, who is Jesus, says, I have to go, for the day breaks. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Bless him. He's already been blessed. More than once. He was blessed in the womb by the promise given to his mother. He was blessed himself when he left home. And he was blessed again when he was heading back home. How much blessing does he need? How many times do we need to hear the truth before it becomes true? It's always true. But that's where the mercy of God comes in. You see, Jesus never wavered, but we do. Jesus never doubted, but we do. Jesus never failed, but we do. And that's why the story's not about us. It's about Jesus. The one who is the Son of God, the one who became one of us, the one who succeeded everywhere where we failed, from Adam on down. And the reason why it's important that we learn to not doubt and not fail is not so that we can add to what Jesus accomplished. It's not so that we can get credit. It's so that we can stop hurting ourselves and hurting others by our doubting. The mistake that Abraham and Sarah made when they took Hagar, that mistake continues to torment the world to this day. So the more we trust him, the less we hurt ourselves and hurt the world. The less we trust him, it's up to us to figure out what the truth is. Jesus says, you will grope after me and find me, even though I was never far from any one of you. The story is that God is better than we imagine, that Jesus has already accomplished everything and won. It's just for us to come in line with what's already true, so that we can have peace, and we can be blessed and be a blessing. We'll see you next time.